Welcome. This is requesting job accommodations under the Americans with Disabilities Act, or the ADA. My name is Tracie DeFreitas. I'm the Director of Training, Services, and Outreach for the Job Accommodation Network, or JAN. I'm going to tell you a little bit about the JAN service so you become familiar with us as an organization and you can take advantage of our service. I've been with the organization now since about 1994. So I've been there quite some time, worn several hats in the disability field. I've been talking about accommodations in ADA for quite some time. My role is a little bit different than it has been in the past, but now I am providing a lot of training on these topics. So we'll go ahead and kick it off and talk a bit about the discussion topics for today. First, I'm going to share a little bit about JAN, again, so you understand what we do, how we can help, how we're a service to anyone who needs us. We'll talk a bit about the basics of the Americans with Disabilities Act, the ADA, which is a federal law in the United States. I'll talk a bit about disability disclosure and provide some tips related to when someone might disclose or why they might disclose their disability. And then get into why somebody might do this to request a job accommodation and offer some resources around that whole process of requesting and negotiating reasonable accommodations at work. So let's talk a bit about JAN, or the Job Accommodation Network. The JAN service was established in 1983. We're a national free consulting service that provides information on the Americans with Disabilities Act and disability employment issues, including job accommodation ideas and resources. We are an expert, trusted, confidential source for this type of information. And we're funded by the U.S. Department of Labor's Office of Disability Employment Policy, or ODEP. So we're not a federal agency, but we are funded through that federal agency. We're housed in Morgantown, West Virginia, on the campus of West Virginia University, but we do serve the entire country. Those who benefit from JAN services include private employers of all sizes, government agencies, employee representatives and service providers, as well as people with disabilities and their family members who are trying to support them in the work environment. Now, JAN serves customers across the United States, and we've been doing that for more than 35 years now. We do serve everyone from that small office in West Virginia, so we do stay quite busy. Our services include individualized consultation and training on ADA and accommodation issues, providing information and referral services, disseminating hundreds of published JAN technical assistance resources, and all of this to kind of assist people as they engage in what we call the accommodation process. And I'll talk a little bit more about that here in just a few minutes. The JAN consulting staff provides free one-on-one practical guidance and technical assistance on job accommodation solutions. Title I of the ADA, that's the employment title of the law, as well as Section 501 of the Rehabilitation Act, which is a similar law to the ADA that applies to federal government employers. And some related legislation as well, like the Family and Medical Leave Act. Sometimes there's some interplay between the various laws affecting people in employment. We also have a small self-employment service that provides entrepreneurship consulting to individuals with disabilities. Now, by providing this trusted guidance on the employment provisions of the ADA and practical accommodation solutions that benefit employers and individuals with medical conditions and disabilities, JAN is here to help cultivate disability inclusive workplaces where people really feel welcome and where they're seen and valued and appreciated for their contributions at work. So we're really here to kind of help make sure that happens. Our motto is Ask JAN, we can help. The JAN staff is unsurpassed in its dedication to improving employment opportunities for individuals with disabilities by providing timely, accurate, and targeted technical assistance and comprehensive resources to our customers. We work as your partner and we meet you wherever you are in the accommodation process. Not everyone's in the same place when it comes to figuring out how to request accommodations or how to provide accommodations. We also maintain your confidentiality and we don't share your information with anyone. So you can contact Jan knowing that your information is going to be protected and it's not going to be shared with anyone else. Jan consultants are highly qualified and experienced, and they come from various professional backgrounds like rehabilitation counseling, social work, ergonomics, education, and legal backgrounds. Most serve as a member of a specialty team. So we have an ADA team, a cognitive neurological team, motor mobility, sensory, and self employment. In addition to providing that expert consultation, some of our consulting staff also design and deliver customized training and speak nationally on ADA and job accommodation issues and create JAN resources as well. The JAN service is easy to use. You can contact us via toll-free telephone lines, live chat from our homepage at askjan.org, or email us. You can also follow us on our social media. For individuals with disabilities, I would suggest using what we call our JAN on demand, which is a way of submitting an email that asks, it's a form that you can complete that asks some questions to help us get some information from you right away. And you can submit that at askjan.org as a way to get quick follow-up uh, service that way. Jan offers an extensive website, askjan.org. It really kind of makes it easy to find the accommodation and ADA information you need. It's a great place to start if you're looking for information of this nature. I'd say definitely get there, look around, try to find some resources that might be helpful. But if you don't find what you need, that's when it's okay to give us a call or contact us via email or chat so we can answer your questions. At askjan.org, you'll find information by roles. So, for example, information for employers or information for individuals with disabilities. We have an A to Z section of our site related to types of disabilities or impairments and limitations, various accommodation solutions, and also disability employment related topics too. You can also directly access ADA regulations, technical assistance, and Equal Employment Opportunity Commission guidance documents, EEOC guidance documents. That information can be found in our ADA library. And throughout the site, you'll find hundreds of informative JAN resources on accommodation and ADA topics and referrals to relevant equipment, services, and other types of organizations that might be helpful in the accommodation process. JIN also offers various learning and development and training services and resources on accommodation and ADA topics too. So there's a whole lot of information there. I do encourage you to visit askjan.org. That's askjan.org to learn more. For more information, go to that website. You can contact us in a way that's convenient for you. Toll free, that live chat, submitting an email. You can follow us on Facebook or Twitter and YouTube. Our office hours are from 9 until 6 Eastern Time, Monday through Friday. So if you would want to contact us, you would want to ensure that it's within that time, or by emailing, you can contact us any time of day, of course. So certainly you can do that if that's more convenient for you. When you do contact us, it's helpful to know information about what sort of disability or impairment or limitations are involved in this situation, whether you're currently employed or not, and just to kind of give us some details about your situation right when you do contact us, because that will help our frontline staff figure out who's going to be the best available consultant to assist you based on the type of question you have or the type of situation that you're needing some guidance on. So if you can give us a little bit of information, it will certainly help us serve you the best. So just know that Jan is here for you. If you need information about accommodations or the ADA, just ask. And as I mentioned, we're here for anyone who has those types of questions. So you're welcome to contact us anytime. So that's just a quick Jan infomercial so that you know a little bit about the service. And I did mention, I believe, that it is free. So we are available free of charge to anyone who needs this kind of information. Okay, now I'm going to shift gears a little bit and talk a little bit about Act, the Americans with Disabilities Act, and just offer some basic details regarding the law so that you're kind of informed, at least as a start, about why it is possible to request accommodations or why it can be expected that employers not discriminate on the basis of disability. So we're just going to cover some sort of real, ADA 101 basic facts related to the ADA. So the ADA, it's a federal civil rights law in the United States. The purpose of Title I of the law is to protect people with disabilities from discrimination in employment and to require covered employers, including private employers with 15 or more employees and state and local government employers, to provide reasonable accommodations for job applicants and qualified employees with disabilities. So, non discrimination and reasonable accommodation are the two statutory requirements of the law. It prohibits discrimination on the basis of disability in any aspect of employment. This includes in hiring, related to pay, job assignments, benefits, and any other terms or conditions of employment. The law requires reasonable accommodation when the employer knows about the individual's disability and their need for an accommodation. A reasonable accommodation, simply put, it's a modification, a change, or an adjustment to a job or the work environment or the way things are usually done that enables a qualified individual with a disability to enjoy an equal employment opportunity. Now, an employer doesn't have to provide an accommodation that will cause what's considered an undue hardship. And that means that the accommodation would be too difficult or too expensive to provide. But an employer can't just simply refuse to provide an accommodation simply because there is some cost involved. So it's a bit more technical than I don't want to pay for something that someone might need at work. There is a process that an employer would need to go to kind of figure out when does something create an undue hardship. And someone who believes they've been discriminated against in an employment situation on the basis of disability. This could be because the employer treated the individual in a way that is protected under the law, or where an employer may not have provided what would have been considered a reasonable accommodation. In those types of situations, an individual could file a complaint. That would be with the U.S. Equal Employment Opportunity Commission, or EEOC. They're the federal agency that enforces Title I of the ADA. Now, you might be wondering what employers must comply with the ADA. Only covered entities must comply with Title I of the law. So that means that job discrimination against individuals with disabilities under Title I of the ADA is unlawful when it's practiced by a covered entity employer. This is a private employer who employs 15 or more employees, or state or local government employer. It can also include employment agencies and labor unions as well. But for simplicity, as I do talk today, I'm going to refer to covered entities as employers generally. Federal executive agencies of the US government are exempt from the ADA, but they do have to comply with a different law. That's the Rehab Act I mentioned earlier, which is almost identical to the ADA. So if an individual works for a federal government employer with the United States, you're going to find that the same requirements apply in terms of non-discrimination and reasonable accommodation. I mentioned earlier that Jan offers a lot of resources, and so I'll be referencing some of those throughout the presentation. This first one is your employment rights as an individual with a disability. That actually is a resource provided by the EEOC. And the other is the Employee's Practical Guide to Requesting and Negotiating Reasonable Accommodations under the ADA. These are good practical guides, resources that kind of help you through the accommodation process. Now, it's also important to know when you're thinking about the ADA or to understand what it means to be a qualified individual with a disability for ADA purposes. Sometimes it's difficult to determine whether you have rights under Title I of the ADA, but understanding some of the terms used in the ADA may help you make that determination. In general, Title I of the ADA protects qualified individuals with disabilities. So the term disability means that a person has a physical or mental impairment that substantially limits one or more major life activities. Could also be a person who has a record of such an impairment, so maybe has a history of having such an impairment, or a person who's being regarded as having a physical or mental impairment that substantially limits a major life activity. With the first two prongs of that definition, somebody who has a current impairment or somebody who has a history of an impairment, in those instances, that is somebody who can request a job accommodation. In the third instance, where someone's perceived as or regarded as having a disability, that's not someone who's going to be entitled to reasonable accommodation. But the idea there is for that prong to kind of protect people from discrimination or being treated in a certain way based on what somebody perceives about them. The term qualified means that you satisfy the skill, the experience, the education, and the other job related requirements for the position that you seek or that you hold, and that you can perform the essential functions of that job with or without reasonable accommodation. So, at the end of the day, somebody who is qualified is someone who can do the job. You may need an accommodation, you may not, but can you perform those essential duties of the position? In that instance, that's where you're going to be looked at as someone who's qualified for the work. Um, when I mention essential job functions, those are job functions that are fundamental to the position. It's the reason the position exists. And so oftentimes it's important, we have to take a look at whether that person can perform what's essential to the position when we're assessing their qualification for the position. And that's where the focus is. Employers don't have to remove essential job duties to make somebody qualified for a position. These are just sort of a lot of technical terms that come up around looking at ADA coverage. So in that, also we need to understand the definition of reasonable accommodation. So what is a reasonable accommodation? Well, it's a modification or change, adjustment to a job or the work environment or the way things are typically done, as I mentioned, that really gives that person an opportunity to participate in that employment experience. Uh, it is the responsibility of the individual to with the disability to let the employer know that an accommodation is needed. So an employer is not expected to guess or assume that somebody needs an accommodation. So when an individual with a disability is aware of that need for accommodation, that's when it makes sense to request an accommodation. And I'll talk more about this in just a few minutes. The ADA does require reasonable accommodation in three aspects of employment. So to ensure equal opportunity in the application process. So during hiring, someone might need an accommodation, or to enable somebody to perform the essential duties of the job, or to also access or enjoy equal benefits and privileges of employment. Sometimes we look to be able to access other things like training, for example. So ensuring that individuals with disabilities have access to those other benefits and privileges is also part of that process. The term reasonable is kind of a legal term. It means feasible or plausible. Think, will it be possible to provide the accommodation without causing undue hardship for the employer? Undue hardship, as I mentioned, is something that employers don't have to assume when they're providing an accommodation. It is an action that's requiring significant difficulty or expense. So is it too costly or too difficult to provide the accommodation? It could be disruptive in some way, or it might fundamentally alter the nature of the business in some way or operation of the business in some way. So in those instances, that's where an accommodation would not be reasonable and then would not be something an employer would be expected to provide. When we're thinking about accommodations, it's important to know that there's not a comprehensive list of accommodations under the law, nothing that the ADA specifically requires as a form of job accommodation. It is something that's very case by case. Examples of reasonable accommodations include things like making a facility accessible and usable. It could be job restructuring, where we might remove a marginal job duty and change how an essential duty is performed. It could be modified or flexible work schedules, could be modifying policies, and there are lots of different policies that come in the work environment. So it could be things like where work is performed, attendance policies, dress policies, things of that nature. It could be providing services like a qualified reader or interpreter or allowing access for a job coach. It could be telework. It could be access for a service or an emotional support animal. It could even be reassignment to an alternative vacant position if that's needed as a form of accommodation, where there's a vacancy and where that individual is qualified. So these are just examples. I think the most important thing to know is that accommodations are not one size fits all. It is something that's very case by case. Jan does offer information about accommodation solutions in the A to Z section of the askjan.org website, or of course, you can contact us for ideas. We can work with you related to your specific situation to kind of come up with solutions or direct you to those that we have available on our site that can be helpful for lots of people. So when we're thinking about accommodations, something that oftentimes comes to mind is disability disclosure. And so I think it's important to talk about disability disclosure and why it is necessary when it comes to the accommodation process. So I'm going to offer some thoughts and tips around disability disclosure and what that means. We do know that deciding if or when or how a disability is disclosed, it can be something that can be overwhelming sometimes, making that decision as to whether to disclose a disability. Oftentimes, people want to keep that disability related information private. So, that disability disclosure decision is one that comes by kind of asking yourself some questions, some personal questions like, do I have an obligation to disclose? When's the right time to disclose? How much information does the employer need? How will disclosing that information affect my employment in some way? So, these are the kinds of things that you may want to be thinking about in order to make the decision about whether to disclose your disability related information. To understand what disclosure is, it's when a job applicant or an employee shares specific personal information about their disability. So, for example, telling your employer that you need to talk about an adjustment or a change that's needed for a reason related to your medical condition. There are three main reasons why someone with a disability may choose to disclose their disability to their employer. The first is to ask for job accommodations. So, under the ADA, employers are only required to provide accommodations for employees who are experiencing workplace problems because of a disability. Therefore, unless you let your employer know that you have a disability, the employer is not obligated to consider accommodations. So, they'll need to know that information in order to figure out if you qualify to receive accommodations under the law. Another reason for disclosure is to receive access to benefits and privileges of employment. Of course, I mentioned that earlier. Sometimes people need to access things that aren't just about performing the job duties, but might be other benefits related to the job. So, if you're having some difficulty accessing those benefits or privileges, then the employer may need to know about that. And they may need to understand why and what sort of accommodation is needed because of your disability. Another situation is often where someone might need to explain an unusual circumstance. So, for example, let's say someone's experiencing performance or conduct issues that are related to the disability in some way, and perhaps that needs to be explained to the employer so that you can talk about ways to resolve those types of issues. So, that might be another reason for disclosure. When someone discloses, it will usually include information about the nature of the medical condition, the limitations involved, or how the disability affects the person's capacity to learn or perform the job effectively. And then also maybe what accommodations are needed on the job if that's the reason you're choosing to disclose your disability. Now, I can offer some tips for disability disclosure. These are things that you just may want to consider and keep in mind that it's very personal. You have to decide what's right for you. But some things that you may want to think about. One is to just not to disclose too soon or too late. So, what does this mean? Well, sometimes people think that they may need to disclose their disability the moment they're hired or before they're hired, and you don't have to do that. Oftentimes, figuring out when to disclose really is about figuring out why the employer needs to know that information. So if you don't need an accommodation, if your disability is not going to affect your ability to do the job in any way or to access benefits or privileges, then in those instances, you probably don't need to share your disability related information. On the other hand, if it's a situation where you maybe are experiencing some performance issues and the disability is a factor in that, you don't want to let that go on too long before you share that disability related information. An employer is not expected to rescind disciplinary action or to change a performance evaluation based on knowing that you have a disability. So, the objective here is to just make sure you ask for what you need or let the employer know what's going on before you get to that point where there's no turning back, basically. So don't wait too long to make that disclosure. When you are going to make the disclosure, you do want to kind of explain why you're doing that so it's clear. The most common reason for disclosure is, of course, to request accommodation. So, in that type of situation, you want to be clear about why you're sharing this disability related information, that it's to request an accommodation so that the employer doesn't have to guess or ask lots of questions about why it is you're sharing that personal information. Another tip is to request accommodation from someone who can act on the request or the disclosure. So if you're going to choose to disclose your disability, particularly to request accommodation, you do want to make sure you're talking to the right people or you're sharing the information with the right people. And that's typically going to be with a someone who maybe is in human resources, perhaps somebody who is a supervisor or manager. But I will say, excuse me, I will say that what that means is if you do go about disclosing to, let's say, a manager, you don't necessarily have to share detailed information about your disability. In that instance, it might be just simply mentioning that you have a disability and that you'd like to request accommodation. Oftentimes, those situations are kicked up to someone in human resources, for example, who then would go about asking you more detailed questions about the disability involved and the need for accommodation. So in those instances, you might reserve some of the finer details about the personal situation if you're talking to a manager, for example. Another thing too is don't disclose to everyone. Your disability related information is your personal information. So it's not necessarily something that you need to be talking to all of your coworkers about, for example. Uh, you can, there's nothing that prohibits you from doing that, but oftentimes I think it's important to kind of keep that information to yourself. So it's not necessary to go ahead and disclose to everyone. So, as I mentioned, the primary reason that people generally disclose their disability and share that information is usually to request a job accommodation. As I mentioned earlier, an employer isn't required to provide an accommodation if someone doesn't have a disability. So, in that case, that disability disclosure is going to be necessary to go through that accommodation process. So, let's talk a bit then about requesting a job accommodation. If you have a disability and you know that you're going to need an accommodation or you're in an employment situation and you recognize that, that's when it may be a case where you have a conversation with the employer or you send them an email, put somebody on notice that you are having some difficulty performing the job duties, and that those difficulties are connected in some way to limitations you might be experiencing because of a disability. But you have to understand, what does that look like? What happened when you're doing that? What is that? And ultimately, it is requesting accommodation. So, according to the EEOC, you would let your employer know that you need that adjustment, a change at work, for a reason related to a medical condition or your disability. You can use plain English to make your request. You don't have to mention the ADA necessarily or use the phrase reasonable accommodation, although I would say we do suggest it. Um, but basically, when an employee indicates that they're having a problem at work and it's related to a medical condition, the employer should consider that a request for accommodation under the ADA and should ultimately act on that. So just to give you some examples of what that looks like, if somebody says, I'm having difficulty concentrating because of medication side effects, or maybe they mentioned that their wheelchair won't fit under their desk. It could be that a healthcare provider has written a note for the individual that says that they need 3 months of leave for medical treatment. Or maybe someone says they want to go to counseling and they need to flex their schedule or leave early on those days. And these types of instances, this is where you can see that there is a connection to disability. There is a medical impairment causing a limitation that also ultimately is leading to some sort of work related barrier in some way. And so when you have all of those factors together, that's when it's looked at as a reasonable or an accommodation request. So, keeping those elements in mind, we'll talk a little bit more about that here in just a second. Now, an accommodation request, just to keep some tips in mind around that, may be made either by the applicant. If you're an applicant and you're seeking an accommodation, let's say for the hiring process, then you could certainly do that. It could be made by an employee on their own behalf. So if you're in a job and you recognize that need, then you could certainly make that request. It could also come from a family member. So in an instance where somebody perhaps doesn't feel as though they're able to make a request on their own behalf, someone else can do that for them. It could also come from a healthcare professional or other representative acting on an individual's behalf. So it doesn't just have to come from the individual with a disability, although it most commonly does. The accommodation request may be verbal or documented in some way. So that could be a conversation, it could be an email that's sent or a written letter for that matter. And there are no particular words or phrases that are required to be used. So as I mentioned earlier, you don't have to say accommodation, you don't have to say ADA, but it's a good idea to do that. And the reason for that is to just be clear about what it is you're seeking, why you're asking for a change at work, and leveraging the ADA to make that happen. So it's important to be as clear as possible, even though the law doesn't require you to get too detailed about it. An accommodation request doesn't need to be made at a certain time. It can be made after somebody's hired, even if it's something that wasn't requested during the hiring process. So that information doesn't even have to be brought up during the hiring process. So let's say 3 months into the job, you realize you need an accommodation. Maybe that's the right time. It is something that may be made oftentimes after performance issues do rise, but it's, as I mentioned earlier, important to try to make an accommodation request before performance issues occur so that you're not in that sort of situation where you're at a final warning with disciplinary action, for example. So it's important to really try to keep in mind that it's best to do it when it's known that the accommodation is needed. The Equal Employment Opportunity Commission offers a lot of guidance documents. One of their most helpful guidance documents is Reasonable Accommodation in Undue Hardship under the ADA. It is a tool that can be used by anyone. It's very informative, easy to read, and offers a lot of great details related to the accommodation process and employer and employee rights and responsibilities. Now, some tips for requesting accommodation. I think it's important for you to decide how you're going to make your request. Is it going to be a face-to-face meeting? Is it going to be an email? Is it going to be a formal letter to the employer? There aren't any official forms that must be used to make an accommodation request. So it's something that you can do on your own. Oftentimes, employers will have you complete a form that they've created once they know you're requesting accommodation. So even though perhaps you haven't done so or documented your request, an employer still can come back and ask you to do that ultimately. Decide who you're going to ask. As I mentioned a little bit earlier, it is important to make sure that you're asking the right people. It's not going to be a coworker. You're going to make that request of somebody in human resources or an EEO office, or a supervisor or manager could start that process for you. So make sure you're making the request of someone who can act on that request. It's important as you make the request to explain why you need an accommodation. So when you do that, explain that you're requesting an accommodation under the ADA, that you might have some ideas for for what accommodations might be needed, but also to explain why. So what are you having difficulty doing? What job duties are impacted by your limitations? So kind of explain what's going on. It's important to go to the employer with solutions at first if you can. Sometimes we don't know what accommodations we need right away, though, and that's all right. It is okay to approach the employer, let them know that you're having some trouble and you'd like to work together to come up with accommodation solutions. So you don't have to have all the answers right away, but it is a collaborative process, so you can work together to come up with solutions. If you make an accommodation request, it's important to follow up. There aren't specific rules related to how quickly an employer must respond to a request for accommodation, but the longer, the process goes on, the longer you may have difficulty doing the work. So make sure you follow up, make the request, maybe a week later if you haven't heard anything from the employer, follow up with them to find out what the status of your request is. Employers do have a duty to respond as quickly as possible, but there's not a time frame within the law that they must follow. If requested by the employer, they may need some medical information, specifically from a healthcare provider or another appropriate professional who can speak to your disability. If it's requested by the employer, provide it as quickly as possible, because otherwise it can hold up that accommodation process. And I'll talk more about that in a second. Also, once you've been provided an accommodation, it is important to monitor that accommodation. So make sure it's working, make sure it's effective, let the employer know if it's not, so that adjustments can be made. Jan offers several resources related to the requesting accommodation and that process. One is requesting and negotiating a reasonable accommodation. The other is how to request an accommodation, and it's a sort of a form letter you can follow to help you write your own request for accommodation. And I'm going to give you sort of an example of what that looks like. So this is a sample accommodation request letter, more specifically related to a mental health example, but we have some others on the site too related to other types of disabilities. But this basically just lays out the general structure of what an accommodation request letter looks like. So you're identifying as a person with a disability or someone with a medical condition, and that you're requesting an accommodation for that medical reason. It's a good idea to mention the ADA, and if known, what accommodation is needed if you have specific ideas. It's important to mention the limitations and what tasks those limitations are affecting as well. If you offer accommodation ideas, it'll help move that process along. And remember, those might not be the only accommodation ideas. It's just a place to start. It's also helpful to ask the employer to offer their own accommodation ideas or to work with you and explore accommodations together. It is possible to attach medical documentation if it's appropriate to your accommodation request. I say typically maybe wait until the employer asks for it. You don't have to provide that documentation right away with your request. So you might just choose to wait until the employer asks you for that information. And you can try to ask the employer to respond to your request in a timely manner. There's nothing that's going to force them to reply within a certain time frame, but it's okay to get that little nudge in there to ask them to do that. So we do have one of those resources we have is sample language for accommodation request letters, and this is one of those examples here. I have been having medical issues that have affected my mood, sleep schedule, concentration, and focus. I'd like to request accommodations so that I might be able to perform my job effectively before my performance starts to suffer. So you kind of start the letter in that way. I won't go through the whole example, but if you're looking for more information on that, that Jan's sample language for accommodation request letters is a helpful resource to give you some other ideas of how that looks like. Now, as you do this, you make that accommodation request. The next step is going to be to engage in what we call the accommodation process. And this is simply a collaborative process for identifying accommodation solutions. Both the individual and the employer have a duty to work together in that process. The more information you can provide up front, usually the process will be a bit more smooth when that happens. Once the accommodation request is recognized by the employer, you'll typically go through the next 2 to 6 steps in the process. First is gathering information. So the employer might go about asking you for additional information about your disability, your limitations, your need for accommodation. Then you'll work together to explore accommodation ideas. And that can happen by contacting Jan if you need ideas. You can work together. Sometimes employers will bring other professionals into that situation to kind of help provide knowledge related to accommodations. So it can be a process. It can take a little bit of time to just work together to come up with ideas. Once the accommodation is chosen and implemented, you will work with the employer to hopefully make sure that the accommodation is working and monitoring that accommodation. There can be times where, as you monitor accommodations, it's found that maybe it's not effective. Maybe we need to explore other options, or maybe we just need to tweak things just a little bit. So it's important to kind of keep those lines of communication open during that part of the process so that everyone's on the same page. And if you need a change, it can get implemented quickly. Now, I want to talk a little bit about the accommodation process and medical information. That second step of gathering information in the process is one that can be a little bit tricky at times. Oftentimes, individuals need to have a better understanding of what sort of information an employer may be asking for and why they might need it. It's important to understand that an employer can go about requesting information about your disability and your limitations and your need for accommodation when these things are not known or obvious. So, particularly in those cases where somebody might have a hidden or invisible disability, one that's not apparent in some way, that's oftentimes when an employer is going to ask for more information. And it is important to try to provide that information in a timely way. Ultimately, they're looking for information that might show you have a disability. So that might be a simple note from your healthcare provider that explains that you do have the disability you say you have, that explains a bit about your limitations and how those limitations affect work. That documentation might also show why you need an accommodation. So, what is it about that disability that's affecting your performance and ultimately leading to the need for accommodation? Um, in those types of situations, sometimes healthcare providers or other appropriate professionals may not really know a lot about accommodations. They may not know anything about the ADA. So you might be educating them at the same time. But oftentimes, what they can do is supply the documentation that's sufficient to establish your right to accommodation under the law by saying the person does have the disability they say they have, by explaining that the person is substantially limited in some form of major life activity. So that's the role of that healthcare provider, is just to really substantiate that for the most part. It's not necessarily their duty to come up with accommodation solutions, although sometimes they can help with that process. And you can certainly ask if they have any ideas, but it's not necessarily their role to do that. Um, so that's sort of the process, and an employer could ask when you make the request for accommodation for you to go to your healthcare provider to get that information. It could also be the case that the employer will provide forms that need to be completed by that appropriate professional as well. So you can ask the healthcare provider to go ahead and complete that documentation for you. That duty falls on the individual to get the information as well as that cost. So, if you're requesting an accommodation, be prepared to be able to provide that documentation if it's needed. It might mean having to set up a visit to go to your healthcare provider or your therapist or counselor, whoever it might be, rehab counselor, who can help you with that documentation. So just kind of be prepared for that if you're going to request an accommodation. Sometimes employers might ask for information that you're not really sure if it's appropriate. Jan can help with that. So if you contact us, we could kind of talk you through the situation to see whether or not the employer is asking for appropriate information. It is okay to kind of push back a little bit too and ask the employer why they need the information. So have a good understanding as to why that employer is asking for what they need in order to move forward in the accommodation process. We do offer some resources, a lot of resources actually, around medical inquiry related situations. To hear medical inquiry in response to an accommodation request, and dealing with improper requests for medical documentation from an employer. So if you feel like the questions asked or the information requested is maybe goes a little bit too far, we have a resource that addresses those types of situations. Okay, so also some accommodation resources or ADA resources that I think it's important to keep in mind. That there's a lot of information out there. At JN, we really try to provide you with some targeted resources to help. When you're going through that accommodation process, it is a negotiation, and sometimes we, run into some bumps along the way as we're negotiating, and so it is important to kind of educate yourself, empower yourself with information so that you know what to do in those types of situations. Some resources that we have available, one is the Employee Accommodation Inquiry Letter. So if you've requested accommodation and maybe you haven't received a response, you're not sure what's going on and you really want to know more. So this is a resource that will help you if you don't know what to do if an employer doesn't respond to your accommodation request. It kind of explains how to go through those steps. How to inform an employer that an accommodation is not effective. Sometimes an individual will request an accommodation and the employer chooses an alternative, which is okay. The employer does have the right to choose the accommodation as long as it's one that's effective. So the ultimate goal at the end of the day is that it is an accommodation that is effective. It enables someone to perform the essential duties of the job. But when that doesn't happen, sometimes we have to communicate that to the employer. So this resource helps with that. Another is dealing with improper requests for medical documentation from an employer. So I already mentioned that one, but if you really feel like the employer is not asking the right questions or asking for too much, that resource will help with that. Leave as an ineffective accommodation is another resource. With that resource, sometimes employers push leave instead of providing an accommodation. And if an effective accommodation can be provided that is reasonable, leave should be a very last resort. So employers shouldn't be pushing leave instead of providing what would be a reasonable, effective accommodation. So that resource kind of talks you through that type of situation. So we offer a lot, and these are just some select resources that I thought would be helpful to our audience today. So to give you some tips, we know as you go through that process, you make the request for accommodation. Sometimes an employer will deny the request, and sometimes it will be a legitimate denial. There could be good reason for it. Other times it's not. So I think you want to, again, empower yourself to be able to ask questions, learn more about why the accommodation is being denied. So one thing you can do is ask for information about why the accommodation was denied. The employer doesn't necessarily have a legal duty to give you that information, but there's no problem asking the question. So certainly try to get the information to help you understand what's going on. Sometimes an accommodation is denied because there wasn't enough medical information provided. In those types of situations, it might be helpful to ask for what additional information would help the employer make a different decision. Was the information insufficient to establish your disability, your right to accommodation? If that's the case, then maybe you can provide additional information that will change the outcome of that situation. If, let's say, it was denied because the accommodation wasn't reasonable, then let's talk about alternative accommodation solutions. So maybe you just need to offer some alternative solutions for consideration. It is possible in some instances to engage in an appeal process. So some employers will have what they call an internal appeal or complaint option internally. So if that's available, you can seek that process out and see if they can reconsider, review your case, and provide hopefully an alternative decision to that type of situation. For those people who are really having a difficult time working with their employer, they really feel their rights are being violated, or they just need some sort of legal backing or some advocacy assistance. In those situations, there is a state agency that is set up in every state. It's referred to as State Protection and Advocacy, or PNA. It's an organization that's designed to assist people with disabilities in these types of situations. And so that is an option for just kind of reaching out to get some legal support. Jan doesn't provide advocacy assistance or legal support, so we will refer to protection and advocacy for that. If ultimately at the end of the day, the accommodation's denied and you really truly feel as though it is something that would be reasonable and the employer's just not providing it, that's when you might be in a position to file a complaint. So a formal complaint can be filed under the ADA with the EEOC, that federal agency. The other option too is that some state fair employment practices agencies, you could also contact them to file a complaint. They will take ADA complaints and work with the EEOC. Also, states also have a a law similar to the ADA. They're all a little bit different, but there are non-discrimination and reasonable accommodation laws at the state level too. So they can help you with that if you're wanting to file at the state level too. We do offer a resource. Your accommodation request was denied. What now? So that walks through all of the different steps that you'd want to consider in that type of situation. So just a few more resources to point out. ADA rights and responsibilities resources, lots of those available to you. All can be found through the JAN website, also through directly EEOC, so eeoc.gov offers various resources. Those on the screen here are both EEOC and JAN resources that you can take advantage of that walk you through the ins and the outs of rights and responsibilities under the ADA. And then, of course, if you're looking for some disability disclosure, requesting job accommodation resources, this is just a recap of some of those resources that I mentioned with some additional in here. For example, the one at the end of the slide, practical guidance for medical professionals. So if you're in a situation where you're working with a healthcare provider or other practitioner of some kind that is trying to support your request for accommodation, as I mentioned before, sometimes they don't know about the ADA or how to help you do that. So Jan offers a resource to kind of help figure out how they can be supportive to you in that process. A couple others on here that I haven't mentioned earlier. We have a section of our website through our A to Z by topic that focuses on disability disclosure topics. There you'll find a whole bunch of resources around disability disclosure if you want more information on that. And various accommodation related information, requesting accommodations for testing or the hiring process if you're somebody who's seeking a job and are looking for some resources related to that as well. So with that, I will go ahead and stop the general presentation. Thank you for the opportunity to share this information. I will see if, I don't know if there are any questions that anyone might like to ask, and I will leave the contact information up for askjan.org, just so everyone has that available to them. We hope that you'll contact us.
Yeah, so Tracie, thank you for the presentation. Incredible information, very well presented, exceptional foundation for not only so many people in our program, but beyond. Before we get into the questions, I just want to share one story of my experience with Jan when I had worked in a disability rights agency that helped secure employment for people with disabilities. And I'd worked with an engineer, dual degree engineer, that had spent 2 years after, despite graduating from an impressive institution as an honors student, spent 2 years unemployed. And part of the challenges that they face is verbal communication. And they had sought with employers that they were interviewing with to get questions beforehand, and then they would just write out their responses and submit them back to them. But I think for some employers, that wasn't the most ideal approach. And ultimately, they were denied, never, of course, because of their disability, but at a certain point, it became, I think, apparent that that was the case. I was fairly new when I first interacted with this individual, and one of my first recommendations is that we call Jan and see what other options were out there. We had explored potential text-to-speech software and other items. From my research, they were going to be fairly expensive, and it's for someone that was out of work. That's a pretty challenging expense to overcome. Probably within the first, I don't know, 2 minutes, the person on Jan said, well, what type of phone do you have? We had an iPhone. And they said, well, you have that. It's already built into your system. You can utilize this. And then gave us another 5 resources that we could use, and then provided some great resources, those hyperlinks that you had mentioned on kind of how we could draft accommodation letters more effectively and so on. Now, that individual ended up securing a very good paying job with the defense contractor. So they went from unemployed to making probably about just under $80,000 a year. And I had done the math that if they retired around 65, it'd be about $8 million that they'd make over their career because of Jan, including saving about $800,000 in public support that was being provided to that individual. So when I say that Jan is one of the best resources that exists for people with disabilities and those that support them, I've got 100 stories to prove it. And I really appreciate you taking the time to share this information, because it very much is life-changing for people who are really just asking for equal employment opportunity in its truest form.
I so appreciate hearing that. I know that, at Jane, we're here to help and we try to do the best we can. And to hear that the information provided really made a difference is huge. So we appreciate that. And you're right. I mean, we try to do what we can to offer practical ideas, practical resources, and to not also recommend anything specific. What we're here to do is to work with you, offer ideas, explore options. We're not going to say that one particular accommodation is going to be the end all be all, because there could be lots of solutions available. So to know that in this instance there was a quick solution, with the iPhone, with having it built in, but there could also be other options to explore as well. And we try to make sure that you have various options to consider, because again, coming back to that idea that accommodations are not one size fits all, we have to have various options to consider. So that's a great success story. Thank you for sharing that.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, I'll go ahead and kick us off with a few questions. First question I wanted to ask you is something that I think most people with disabilities who are requesting an accommodation experience, which is a certain level of, let's say, politely hesitancy that employers may have in granting that accommodation. Sometimes in advocating for a right, that can feel inherently confrontational, and it's very challenging to I think have that conversation. And I think for employers also challenging to understand how to best navigate that conversation. Really, my question is, what would you recommend someone do with a disability as they're requesting accommodation to maybe navigate a situation where they feel that the employer may be a little bit more resistant to their request for accommodation? What other maybe tips and tactics might you take?
One of the things I suggest is that when you're ready to approach the employer, approach them with a solution-oriented approach to the situation. Because, if we just go to our employer and say, I have a problem, this isn't working, I'm unhappy with something, or, or say I can't do something, I think that maybe right away that situation might not go over so well. If you, on the other hand, can go to the employer, provide information, help them understand what's going on, show them that you've thought about the situation and you've really kind of checked into your own resources, you have explored what could be possibilities and said, I want to keep working. I want there to be a solution to this situation. Can you help me? Can we work together? I like that approach, with the hope that they won't be confrontational, that they won't just see the individual coming to them with a problem, but rather they see the individual saying, I recognize that there are some limitations here, but I know I can do this. And with your help and working together, that is one way that we can, work toward hopefully a successful employment outcome. So that's just sort of my practical approach to it. I really think focused on a solution-oriented approach to the situation should be the first step.
And then if I could flip that question just a little bit and say, if you were to advise an employer that maybe culturally might be a little bit more resistant, what advice might you give them to help them kind of recognize the value of the accommodation process?
Good way to flip that around. Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think it's important for the employer too to we say the same thing to employers. You also should have a solution-oriented approach, because ultimately, at the end of the day, you have a business to run and you have employees that you want to be able to meet the needs of your business. And to ensure that that's going to happen, you need to work with people who are qualified and able to do the job. So, in order to ensure that, work together to come up with those solutions so that ultimately, at the end of the day, both needs are met. You have the business needs being met as well as the individual's needs being met.
And that's often what I'd advise too. What's really interesting, I'd actually read from the Yang Tan Institute, is that employers don't understand accommodations as a productivity enhancement. And I think if you understand it that way, then you recognize the value that not only can it have to your employees with disabilities, but to your workforce holistically. And so I believe it was, they were referring to either JP Morgan or Ernst & Young, which had realized that through the accommodations process, through their ADA committee, they were actually able to identify accommodations for people with disabilities that had that curb cut effect for people without disabilities as well, and thus improve the productivity of a larger workforce. And I've always found that to be a very compelling reason, if I was an employer, to look at the
Absolutely.
accommodations process as really a strategic asset rather than kind of a compliance process.
And when you think about that, I will say, I mentioned earlier that Jan's been around for a long time. We were providing information on accommodations before there was any compliance. So before the ADA was enacted, we were talking about accommodations, ways to keep people working. And you're right. When we look at accommodations, accommodations help everyone. It's not just about people with disabilities. And in truth, accommodations are provided to everyone. We just don't always call them
Right.
accommodations.
Right.
We have workplace flexibility, and that is helpful to everyone. So, or lots of people, I should say. But we just don't necessarily call it an accommodation. So you're right. I like the way that you put that. Is it's something that it enhances what we do at work, and can benefit not just people with disabilities.
I appreciate that. One other question I had is around kind of understanding as an accommodation. And so there are a lot of people I work with, say, for example, with autism, that would be working in environments that were inherently maybe accommodating. They were able to kind of flex around and things like that. But the primary accommodation they needed was a certain level of understanding. And that's a very vague request to make. And I think challenging for an employer to interpret what that means and so on. This might be a very difficult question, but how would you advise either an individual who identifies understanding as their primary accommodation or an employer who receives that as the primary request? Like, how do you navigate that type of accommodation to, best serve the situation?
Yeah, and those can be tricky situations. You're dealing with a level of understanding. You're also oftentimes dealing with personalities who might not get each other. They may not be able to work well together. But I think ultimately, a lot of times that comes back to communication and just figuring out how we can best communicate with one another, and educating people that it can happen in different ways. So you're right. It is a difficult question to answer generally, because it is something that I think you're going to see unique to each individual circumstance. So back to that one size, doesn't fit all. I think you need to explore, how does understanding happen best for the individual, and what's the method or mode of communicating so that they can grasp the information, so that they can recognize what they're being asked to do, or what the work tasks are, or how they're, what the expectations are and whether they're meeting them. So it is very case by case. I think we have to understand the individual's unique limitations, or their unique way of understanding things, and then educating. Unfortunately, I think a lot of times people who are in management positions, or or leaders, are responsible for conveying the information. They may be busy. They may not want to take the time needed to make adjustments. And I think culturally, that's something that needs to change a little bit. And, sometimes we need to just take a step back and recognize that if we make just a few adjustments, it might not be lots of adjustments,
Mhm.
that can make a world of difference. So that's all part of the process, that collaboration and just figuring out the unique circumstances.
Excellent. And let me ask you one more about those seeking a diagnosis. And so I think when we understand the ADA, or when people think about the ADA, or when they think about accommodations, they're often thinking about it from a very kind of specific diagnosed, disability. To what extent does Jan help, or the ADA, cover individuals who are in the process of seeking a diagnosis but have clear manifest symptoms?
Yeah, that's a really good question. And it is one that I would say we're getting more and more, particularly with people who may be experiencing issues around long COVID, for example.
Mhm.
So they may be going through a process of trying to get that diagnosed, and they know they're experiencing limitations. They're seeking treatment or help, and they're not really sure, what to do. I think in those instances, we know that from an ADA standpoint, it's not as if a specific diagnosis is necessarily needed or that an employer needs to request that in order to provide an accommodation. It's getting an understanding that the person has a medical situation. It is one that is affecting their ability to sort of carry out daily life activities in some way. I think in those cases, if the individual is able to supply some information from their healthcare provider or another appropriate professional that explains what they're going through, explains how the medical condition is affecting that person, hopefully that will help the employer understand the situation best and lead to them working through that accommodation process. It's there's not one way to go about it, but I think if the individual can offer some degree of information that helps establish a medical condition, limitations affecting work, and the need for accommodation, it may not just be about the specific diagnosis necessarily.
I think that's exactly right. I think the concept, and I love how the ADA is written, where it's framed as, an impairment that limits rather than a specific
Yeah,
disability. And I think if we understand it in that context, then those seeking diagnosis through those symptoms would, God willing, of course, have protection.
yeah.
Um, Let me
And
ask
I will
you.
also say, I'm sorry, just to piggyback on that a little bit, with the ADA, the definition of disability is to be interpreted broadly. It
Mhm.
is something that shouldn't require significant analysis. So for that reason, too, coming back to the specific diagnosis, it's not just about that. We encourage employers to, instead of getting sort of hung up on that and being stuck in that place of, does the person have a disability? If you know the person has a medical condition, it's affecting work in some way. All right, let's kind of move beyond that. Let's move beyond that, and now let's take a look at, is what the person's asking for reasonable? So is the
Mhm.
accommodation something that's possible? Is it plausible? Can we provide it without getting stuck on that disability part of that, scenario? So that's just one thing to consider, is if we can get employers beyond that determining disability to, can we provide an accommodation? That's what we try to encourage employers to do.
And I love what you're saying there, because it's very much like under the context of enlightened leadership. If your goal as an employer is to help your employees be as effective as they can, and be as productive as they can, et cetera, then the accommodations process and this kind of positive approach to it is just a natural outgrowth of that.
Right.
And not something that needs to be viewed as kind of a negative compliance oriented process. So I love that phrasing and that
And,
framing very
and
much.
we try to really say, we're trying to get employers to go beyond that compliance. The compliance is sort of a bar, but you want to go beyond compliance wherever you can.
So now let me ask one last question, because I'd ask you all day if I could. But last question for me, just in regards to self-employment. This was actually news to me when you introduced that. Very cool. I'll tell you that Michigan Rehabilitation Services, when I read their Michigan State University's review of them for 2020, it was among MRS counselors the single highest identified challenge that they were facing as an
Oh, yeah.
organization. And I actually, in my previous life, had helped people with disabilities create their own businesses, and can speak very much to that need that exists in the community. Can you tell me a little bit about just what Dan's doing more in that space?
Sure. It's a service that we've offered for many years now. We have one consultant, Kimberly Cordingly, who focuses on entrepreneurship and self-employment opportunities. And what she essentially does is we'll talk with the individual about what they're aspiring to do, what their interests are, and she oftentimes will develop a full list and when I say list, I mean packet of resources and information that can help them in their area for establishing their own business. And it's a small service, it's just a tiny little part of what we do here. But it is a service that's available to those individuals who choose choose self-employment as a path versus other types of employment. So we do have a small section of our site that addresses that part of our service. But ultimately, what I would say the best thing to do if people are interested in that would be to email the service or email Jan and let them know what you're looking for, what kind of information you need around self-employment, and that'll get directed to Kim.
Excellent. With that, Johnny Martins, any questions?
No, I'm okay. No questions.
Excellent. Okay. Well, seeing none, Tracie, let us know when you're running for president because I'm voting for you. Did a wonderful job, great answers. Couldn't have asked for anything better. Exactly what I knew was going to be coming out of a program like Jan. So appreciative that you've given us your time and your expertise. I know that our network is going to be more than appreciate the chance to review this video and your blog and everything else that comes with it. So thank you so much.
Thanks for inviting us to present the information. I know I have two colleagues who will be presenting again here in the next few weeks. So lots more information to come.
Thank you so much.
Take care, all of you. Bye.
Okay, bye everyone.